everybody, Griff Hamlin here from Blues Guitar Unleashed. Welcome and thanks for joining me today. Today's lesson isn't really a blues thing, admittedly. We don't use the major scale in blues, pretty much ever. But the major scale is, from a theoretical standpoint, pretty much the most important scale in the universe. It really is the thing from which we can derive almost anything else. And while a lot of people will say, oh, I don't want to learn any music theory, this is a great sort of way to slightly open that door for music theory and give you something that is useful. But what I found about music theory is that if you study music theory in a vacuum and you don't use it, it seems useless, and it seems like something that doesn't have any place and doesn't make any sense. If, on the other hand, you use a little bit of theory, often you realize how handy it can be, all right? And you realize, oh, there actually is a place for this in my learning. So I want to show you the major scale because, like I say, you can do almost anything else from it, and I'll give you a little bit of taste of that as we go. Now, there's of course more than one way to play a major scale. There's actually lots of them. So we're going to start with a very simple idea, which is we're going to play the whole scale on one string. So the way you kind of calculate a major scale is you start with any note. In this case, I'm going to start with the open A. Okay, the open A string. From here, I'm going to go to my second note is one whole step, which is 2 frets. So there's a B in this case, A to B. From the second to the third note, again, is always one whole step, or 2 frets. So I have A, B, and this will be C sharp. From the third to the fourth note is always a half step. Okay, 1 fret, what we call a half step. So I have A, B, C sharp, D. From the fourth to the fifth note is also a whole step. So D to E, it's a whole step. 2 frets. From the fifth to the sixth note is always a whole step. So our sixth note is F sharp. From our sixth to the seventh note is always a whole step. So F sharp to G sharp. And from our seventh to our eighth, or back again to the root, is always a half step. So notice that it's a whole step between every pair of notes except the third to the fourth and the seventh to the eighth. So starting anywhere else, let's say I started on F. F, go up a whole step, G, whole step, A. That's the third note, so now I only go up a half step. B flat, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And that whole idea of, like from here, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So 2 whole steps and a half step, 3 whole steps and a half step. And I can do it from anywhere. And you probably recognize that sort of, do, re, mi, fa sound. It's like I say, the major scale is kind of the staple of all of our music. It's sort of the musical universe that we pull from, okay? But it's not practical in most instances to play it all on one string. Occasionally, it's useful, so you should be able to do it. But usually what we use is what I call a 2-octave fingering. So I'm going to start on A. Let's start on C. What the heck? There's no sharps or flats in the key of C. So we're going to go, I've got my third finger on a C at the 8th fret. Then I'm going to put my pinky at the D of the 10th fret on the 6th string. Now, so there's 8 and 10 on the 6th string. My E, F, and G are going to be my 1st, 2nd, and 4th fingers on the 7th, 8th, and 10th frets of the 5th string. My A, B, and C are going to be my 1st, 3rd, and 4th fingers on the 4th string at the 7th, 9th, and 10th frets. So I've got 8, 10, 7, 8, 10, 7, 9, 10. And that's what we call the first octave. From one note to the next occurrence of that note is called one octave. Lots of theory in here, lots of fun Theory fun time, as I call it, because I love theory. Okay, from here, I'm going to go up to the next string. For my second, third, and fourth is going to be D, E, and F, also on the 7th, 9th, and 10th frets of the third string. On the second string, I'll have my G and A on the 8th and the 10th fret. And then the B, C is the 7th and the 8th fret on the top string. And I could even add my D. I can reach that. That's the second of the scale. So 8, 10, 7, 8, 10, 7, 9, 10 for the first octave. 7, 9, 10, 8, 10, 7, 8 for the second octave. Add the D if you want to. And this is a pattern that I strongly advise you to learn. And once you know it, you can put it anywhere and it doesn't change. From a technique standpoint, also, notice that when I play 2 of the notes, I don't lift the old fingers up. When I play 3 notes, the old fingers are still there. So this is a good way to also practice your technique. Try and keep finger movement to a minimum. So you're doing double duty. I always like to do that. And as you get better and better, you can play it rather quickly. Okay? Now, why would you want to learn this? Okay, so the big debate with theory a lot of times that I see, like I said, is people will say, oh, I don't want to learn any theory. It's boring. It doesn't do anything for me. I just don't see any use for it. Totally get it. Depending on how you define music theory, everybody kind of has to know some music theory to some degree. In other words, if you know, for example, that you're playing, a blues in A, and you know that that's the next chord, okay, well, you may not know what to call that next chord, but you're still doing the right thing. You're playing the right notes. And the reason that that next chord is what it is because it's called the 4 chord. So why do we call it the 4 chord? Well, from any starting note, if I build a chord, that's what we call the 1 chord, right? So we often talk about the 1 chord and the 4 chord and the 5 chord. Well, if you look at my major scale, 1, okay, so if I'm in A, 1 is A. So there's my 1 chord. I built a chord off the first note in the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the 4th note. Notice that it's right above the first note, just up a string. And I put a chord there, so therefore it's the 4 chord. It's the chord built off the 4th note in the scale. So you hear people talk about a 1, a 4, and a 5, right? Well, there's the 5th note of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's how I get that. Some people might say, oh, it has a 2-5 turnaround. Well, there's the 2, so I build a chord off of it. There's the 5, so I build a chord off of it, right? We often throw these numbers around, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll say like, oh, it's a 1, 4, 5, or that's got a 1, 6, 2, 5 turnaround. You hear people talk about this stuff all the time in blues. Well, that's theory. That's theory at work, okay? That's music theory at work, and it can be a very valuable thing to have. Sometimes we'll talk about chords, right? The notes in a chord. The way you come up with the notes in a 7th chord is the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and what's called the flatted 7th. So you take the 7th note of the scale and you flat it, meaning lower it a half step. To sharp a note is to raise it a half step. To flat a note is to lower it a half step. And that's how I come up with this chord. You'll notice that there's a root, that's the 5th, that's the flat 7, that's the 3rd, that's the 5th, and that's the root. Sometimes people add their pinky right there. How come? Well, because it's a flat 7. So it works. And if you know the names for this stuff, you'll find that lo and behold, every time you do it, every time you do something that you thought didn't use any theory, it happens to adhere to these theory rules that we talk about. So the major scale, from knowing a major scale, you can theoretically build any other scale in any chord. And you don't actually have to know really any other theory at all. All you have to know from that point is the formula. So if you can remember the whole step, half step, whole step, half steps, 2 whole steps and a half step, 3 whole steps and a half step. The way I like to remember it is everything's a whole step except between the 3rd and the 4th and the 7th and the 8th. If you can remember that, if you can remember that fingering pattern to play it, you've got a major scale and you can use that. And if you get it down and you get it memorized and you start to examine the things that you can do with that scale, you'll find there's an awful lot of them. So today I'll leave you with that much and hope that you have some fun with it. Please take some time to practice on it. Make sure that you remember how to play the scale. Just add it to your practice routine. Just play it through a couple of times each day. It's the most valuable scale you'll ever know. Outside of the blues scales, which we use for soloing, those are also incredibly important and you gotta know them. But the major scale for all music, the major scale is sort of the granddaddy of everything, and it's the one that you want to make sure to have in your back pocket. Okay? So, hope you enjoyed the video as always. If you have friends that you think would enjoy this video, please share it with them. And I'm Griff Hamlin. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.